you were a little kid and you believed in fairy tales, that fantasy of what your life would be like. White dress, Prince Charming who sweeps you away to a castle on a hill. You would lie in bed at night, close your eyes, and you had a complete and utter faith. They were so close you could taste them, but then you grow up. One day you open your eyes and the fairy tale disappears. But the thing is, it's hard to kind of forget about the fairy tale entirely because deep down, every one of us has that same hope and that same faith. It's a quote from Grey's Anatomy, but it pretty much sums up how we feel about fairy tales, how we feel about once upon a time, happily ever after. They're phrases that dominated our childhood playtime. We dreamed about them at night. Who wouldn't want to live happily ever after given the option, right? But where does that come from? Where do we get happily ever after? Where do our fairy tales originate? You'd probably be surprised to know that the original fairy tales were a lot less like our childhood dreams and a lot closer to what we might think of in our nightmares. It's true. NationalGeographic.com says, looking for a soothing tale to waft you toward dreamland? Well, then you better look somewhere else. Because the original fairy tales by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm were a lot scarier. They portrayed life as early Europeans would have seen it in the early 1800s, capricious and oftentimes cruel. So let's take a look at the original fairy tales, people's reactions to the original fairy tales, and how as a result of those reactions, we got the fairy tales that we know and love today. According to the Hard Facts of Grimm's Fairy Tales by Maria Tater, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm never intended for these stories to become bedtime stories that people read to their children. These stories are originally the Grimm brothers' attempt to capture the authentic language of the Volk, which was a vulgar German language that was oftentimes burlesque. They were simply trying to preserve these German folk tales. They never had any clue that people would start reading them as stories to their children when they put them to bed at night. An example of the graphic nature can be seen in the early version of Little Red Riding Hood. Red says to the wolf, "Oh dear Mr. Wolf, if you don't bite me, I'll give you my silken shirt." The wolf replies, "I don't want your shirt sewn with silk. I want your young body and blood." Red lets out a scream, but by the time anyone gets to her, all they find is a bloody arm. The Grimm fairy tales have the same gruesomeness in pretty much every fairy tale that you can read by them. They're entwined in them. It's not exactly the sort of stories that inspire peaceful, happy dreams, huh? I know I wouldn't want to put my children to bed with them, and apparently I'm not the only one who shares that sentiment. Let's see how people reacted to them. According to the reception of Grimm's fairy tales, responses, reactions, and revisions by Donald Haas, there's never been a seamless tradition of positive Grimm reception. Actually, the Grimm brothers got a lot more negative reactions than they got anything. According to the AssociatedContent.com, people objected to these stories for two reasons. First, the information was deemed too scholarly for younger readers. And second, the content was seen as bad for children. They contained witches, trolls, goblins, and wolves who prowled dark forests. The original tales were very dark, says CandlelightStories.com, and they didn't make any attempt to keep from scaring their listeners regardless of age. Grimm's fairy tales were not at all appropriate for young children. Some of the tales contained violence and prejudice. Quite frankly, there's some good things about these early stories, but their extreme cases of racism and anti-Semitism are extremely accurate when you talk about these fairy tales. It sounds a little harsh for Once Upon a Time, doesn't it? The Grimm brothers thought so too, so eventually they started changing their fairy tales. Let's look and see what they did about it, and how what they did about it came to be the fairy tales that we know and love today. In response to criticisms, Associated Content tells us that the Grimm brothers made changes to these stories. Family ties were protected by changing the wicked mother to a wicked stepmother. Sexual references were obviously left out. And violence was stepped up, but only toward evil characters. Overall, the German public enthusiastically welcomed this new version of the Grimm's fairy tales. They contain magic as well as kings and talking animals. They teach us a lot of valuable life lessons, such as morality, good and evil, and even things about death. In his article, Playful Adaptations of Grimm's Fairy Tales, William Browning talks about how the tales have been watered down and made even more appropriate for children over the last 200 years. Eventually, these tales were gotten a hold of by Walt Disney, which is how most of us know him today. Several of Grimm's themes are left out, obviously, but there are some very apparent Grimm references in them. The original stories of Rapunzel and Rumpelstiltskin involve parents giving up their children. Disney's take on it is a little different. In Tangled, Rapunzel's taken away from her family. And in Shrek, Fiona still has her family and far, far away. Disney traded in the Grimm's damsel in distress version of things in favor of spunky, independent leading ladies who can hold their own against beasts, outsmart persistent wolves, learn karate while imprisoned in a tower awaiting true love's kiss like Fiona and Shrek, all with a bit of humor, wit, and some magic. They say life's a journey. It's dynamic. It's ever-changing. These fairy tales are evidence to that. people change, so the stories changed with them. That's why they're timeless. That's why we know about them today. If they hadn't changed, they would have probably fizzled out back when the reactions were bad. To me, the story of the fairy tales, the story of the origins, remind me of the quote that goes a little something like this. You can rejoice because thorns have roses, or you can be sad because roses have thorns. It's all in how you look at it. To me, it's a beautiful picture of how something started out so dark and so twisted, but it came to be like our childhood, like the revisions and the steps, the process it took to get to where it is today. Like that's the reason we dream like we do. It's the reason we have these ideas of happily ever after, all because they've come such a long way. So I hope the next time you hear Once Upon a Time, you smile to yourself and you think about how far your fairy tales have come.